Today we're going to be making live chat conversations count.
In a similar vein, can you take unstructured data, aka real-time chat or chatter that is happening around a live stream on Zoom or on YouTube, and give it a structured and visual look? Look.
I've got a very special guest lined up for you today. We all know that starting conversations can be a tricky thing. So when it comes to breaking the ice in many a situation, whether that be over the phone, in meetings, or online in a group setting, there are lots of ways that you can get the conversation flowing. Today's guest, Lux, has a book aptly titled Name, Place, Animal, Thing. Now you've got 4 different answers running around in your head, but hold on to those thoughts, because today we're going to be making live chat conversations count. Over to you, Lux.
It feels like I already know you since I've listened to some of your episodes. You sound very familiar, very, very obviously. So,
so who have you been listening to, may I ask?
I listened to the recent one. This was this lady who talked about, I'm just trying to remember the topic. I think she's ex-Google or something.
Oh, Simone. Yes, Human Connection.
That whole speech came out of me complete, exactly as you saw it on stage.
It's July 2005, and I'm standing at the departure gate of Perth International Airport. And my mother isn't speaking to me. In fact, she hasn't spoken to me for 6 months because I announced that I would be leaving my university degree midway to launch a career in entertainment in the city she migrated away from with much effort, Singapore.
Yeah, and the pandemic, there's a book she wrote called the silent pandemic.
The secret pandemic.
The secret pandemic. I knew I was messing up something over there, yes.
It's funny, isn't it? It's stories we remember.
I'm very bad with remembering names and things. It's just that part about the secret. Just the title itself was very evocative because it obviously strikes a chord. And then when I heard the episode, it kind of resonated a little more because you've seen so many instances of that, right? Over the course of the last couple of years of this parallel thing of people being alone and stuff. But yeah, the stories resonate as opposed to the names per se. Yes, absolutely. And
it's interesting, isn't it? Because I was looking at some of the things that you've been getting up to think about, right? What are we going to talk about today? What are we going to share with our listeners? And there were a few things that struck me. The first thing was, I love that you do comedy, because that means that we're going to get on like a house on fire. If you can put up with my sense of humour, that is. 2,000 obituaries. That's a strange kind of hobby to have. How did that all come about?
The obituaries thing has been a passion as I've traveled across countries. So, as I've gone to different places, and you obviously subscribe to the local newspaper, which was in the main newspaper in Dubai, the main newspaper in India, in Bombay, in Chennai, and now the New York Times here in the US on the East Coast where I live. Someone told me this decades ago, and it struck a chord, saying if you want to read, and this was of course a time when newspapers had only one section and they weren't about 5 pounds in weight or something. So they would say if you want to read about man's accomplishments, start the newspaper from the backside, because that's usually where the obituaries would be.
Yeah.
And if you want to learn about man's failures, start from the front page. And I think that's nowhere as resonant as it is today, because take the front page, it's about the effects of climate change, it's about war, it's about 100 different things that are going wrong in the world. And then you read the back page and you read about accomplishments and things that people did. And it just became a fascination. And I think that kind of melded with my previous work life, which was I was running a company called Unmetric, where we used historical social media data on brands to help brands plan for the future. So essentially let history be your guide, right? And
yes.
So those two worlds literally collided over there.
It's interesting though, isn't it? Because legacies, we talk about legacies and what we leave behind. And for the listeners' benefit, we're recording this it's just been a few days since the Queen of Elizabeth died. And the media is and social media, it's just full of conversations, and it's all relating to that, isn't it? And we're hearing the 70 years of service and the legacy that she left behind. And actually, I think what's more important is that she was a living legacy because she lived it, and it will live on with her. So when you hear people's stories and those obituaries, it is really how people have been touched and affected.
Absolutely.
By being in closeness or just, feeling it in their life.
When we dug in, it was interesting to see certain things that stood out, right? Like in terms of, we live in an era where instant gratification and the desire to accomplish things are a lot earlier in life. People want to have achieved everything they want to do in their 20s, in their 30s and stuff. So it was interesting to see the data and see that most of the folks that, for example, the New York Times featured in their obituaries had done their first significant achievement, I think, around the age of 42 or so, right? So that is an instant lesson in the virtues of patience. There was so much in the arts. There was so many commonalities when we dug in and looked at what they'd done. And spoiler alert, a vast majority of them had done something around helping others. It could have been helping in a very direct sense of the word. It could have been helping in terms of understanding something or helping to learn something. But the word help was probably the most resonant word as we dissected, the first paragraph of so many obituaries. Actually, it was the second most common word. The first most common word was John. So that's a hat tip. If you want to name a kid, John's a good name. So.
What's the link then, Lux, between art and achieving at an age and helping? Because that's kind of like a cocktail there, isn't it? And I'll explain why I'm interested in a moment.
I'm struggling to get individual instances, but I remember things like, for example, people who used theater. This one, I forget the name again. I'm very bad with remembering names, but this one, I think he was a pastor, but he was not remembered as much for that, as much as he was for using theater to help people who had been traumatized by war to come out of it. Right? So he was using theater as an instrument to help people just overcome trauma. There was someone else who was using different kinds of arts just to help people in inner cities start second careers. I think in instances where those things happen, it is a little more direct. And there were sometimes people who, whose art itself helped people see a certain phase of the arts or a certain phase of realism or movies or things that they hadn't been attuned to earlier. So it could have been directly from their craft, or it could have been in terms of helping people. But the word help was dominant. And the arts part was especially resonant for someone like me. I'm from India originally, and we're guilty of, at least earlier, fortunately it's changing now, insisting that a kid is a success only if they go into medicine or engineering or one of those preordained paths, right? So things like the arts, when I was growing up, was seen as frivolous, but it was seen as something that would be a definite path towards starvation. So it was just interesting to see that a lot of those folks were remembered and they did some amazing things. It just paints that kaleidoscope that is not so obvious when you're a kid about to start off on college or something like that. So I thought that was fascinating as well.
You've lost your Indian accent, I've got to say that, Lux. It's
I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing, okay?
It's quite New York. I would say as well, though, that, if you think about India as a nation, when you think arts and culture or sport, you would automatically go Bollywood, cricket. That would be, the only two opportunities. And I know that that's a massive generalisation, but it's much the same as, you're going to be a doctor or a lawyer, isn't it? It's the same thing. So it's good that we can offer way more opportunities now, no matter your culture.
Absolutely.
So look, going from the obituaries thing, did that give you the idea for the name, place, animal thing?
To some extent, actually, the way name, place, animal thing happened was related to the obituaries, but it was a parallel journey that I was going through during my previous company. I'd given this talk about, what was it, about 6 years ago in Jaipur. And this was a talk on perspective. And, often you just dump a whole bunch of ideas and then you're trying to find some interesting narrative vehicle to put them into. And I literally had all these post-its that I put saying, these are my 21 slides. And I was trying to find a narrative string through all of them. And I just found that the name, place, animal thing was actually a childhood game that's very familiar to people from the subcontinent. I actually realized that those 21 post-its that I had on the wall the night before my talk in Jaipur actually fit that pattern, where some were about places, some were about things, some were about, getting in touch with your inner animal. And a few of them were about people who wore varied hats and were not known for just one thing and therefore carried multiple names in society, right?
Yeah, yeah.
And also over the course of life in general, and especially my previous startup, where this was in a pre-pandemic phase, where you actually meet people in person very often at a conference or a bar or a restaurant or a coffee shop. The standard opening question would be, so what do you do? Right?
It stumps so many people. I don't know why it stumps so many people, but how do you get the name, place, animal thing into that? What do you do? Explain it.
So what do you do was a question that vexed me for a fair amount of time, because most people, including me, would answer it with the most recent line on our LinkedIn profile. Right?
Okay, so Lux, what do you do?
So So I would have earlier answered that as I'm the CEO and co-founder of StreamAlive, an application that helps make live streams alive, right? Which I still am. But if you had asked me the question today, I'd probably indicate, do you mean what do I do for a living, or what do I do in life? Which then encourages you to ask more, first understand and appreciate that there are more dimensions to everybody. And okay, let's talk about work, and then let's talk about what else you do. Let's talk about your love for comedy and stuff. But just opening the conversation to that, because very often it's a closed-ended conversation where we're just saying, I'm a banker with XYZ bank and I look at mortgage loans, and that's it, right? There's so much more to every person.
Context, isn't it? It's putting the context around it. Yeah.
Exactly. And when you reframe the question by asking a question back at times, or you say, I love mining the intersections of different worlds. Okay, what do you mean by that? So, there's my work world where I do this, there's comedy, there is this. And I think there's a lot of fun in intersecting those different worlds. So there's different ways to give it, but the thing behind name, place, animal thing. So the book started off as a non-fiction book, which then became, I thought, a little too didactic. So cardinal mistake of rereading what I had written before I'd finished it, and then decided, no, I'm not going to read this myself. So rewrote the entire book in my favorite genre, which is allegories, where it's like a story like The Monk Who Sold His Ferrari or Jonathan Livingston Seagull, or one of those genres where there's a story or a narrative.
I love Jonathan Livingston Seagull.
Oh, it's a beautiful book. I just reread it about a year ago. Yeah. So there's a story, and there are interesting nuggets or lessons or things peppered through the story. So the cognitive load is relatively lower, and hopefully it's an easier read that way, right? The thesis behind the book is simply, it goes in reverse. It starts with thing, which is make more things, physical and virtual. Make things like podcasts, but also make things with your hands. So make things, make something. Animal is get in touch with your inner animal and recognize that at the core we're fundamentally a living, breathing cytoplasm. So it's good to remember that once in a while. And place was nowhere near as resonant as it was during the pandemic, where you couldn't travel far and wide. And a lot of the thesis there is travel near and narrow, because there's enough things in our own backyard that most of us have not seen.
Yeah, so place could be where you feel most at home, where you come from, where you live now, where you want to travel to. It can be so many things, can't it, when you really stop to think?
Absolutely. And if travel's what you want to do, because it's a great teacher, there's enough culture and different languages and cultures and things you can immerse in within probably about 20 miles of where you live for most people, right? That's place. And the overarching theme is name, which is, don't just have one badge or one thing you're known for, or that you answer when people ask you, so what do you do? More importantly, when you answer to yourself, have a bunch of things that get defined by the places you visit, getting in touch with your inner self, and making more things. So that's kind of the gist of the book.
It's smart. I love that idea that you can, it's like there are. I was taught tricks for networking. Rather than saying that what you do, you can lead up to it by sort of saying, "Did you have any problem finding the place? Where have you come from? What was the journey like? Do you know many people here?" Those sorts of things that sort of gently ease into, rather than, "So, who are you? What's your name? Where do you come from? And what's your inside leg measurement, please?" Because it can really put people off, can't it? And there's a certain anxiety when it comes to meeting new people anyway, that you don't want to be sort of oversharing either.
There's so much anxiety rooted in it because there's an undercurrent of I'm assessing whether it's worth my time to talk to you from this point onwards, right? So there is that little undercurrent over there which doesn't augur for good conversation.
Oh, I don't know. I mean, I think it's perspective, isn't it? And it's something that we explore with every guest. There are certain commonalities that I think that all guests are in agreement with me in, and that is that you need to apply a little bit of common sense to a conversation, but also sometimes you kind of need to be reminded of the most simple things, because we can be overthinking some very complex situations when we're at work and involved in other things, that we kind of just need to, bit like children, just be reminded of those things.
By the way, just on a very related theme, I was very excited to speak with you, not just because I'd heard your previous episodes and love the way you do it, also because of the central theme that you have, which is, making conversations count. 2 years back, if you asked me if I knew what I'd be doing right now, I had absolutely no clue. But what I'm doing right now was born from conversation. And what it does is facilitate conversation. So getting on a podcast that says making conversations count was like, okay, it can't get better than this.
I didn't know 2 years ago either what I was doing. I wouldn't, if I'd have said to you that as we're recording this, it's the time for the 100th episode. 2 years ago, If you'd have said 100 episodes in, I'd have gone, no, don't be silly. I don't even know what I want to talk about yet. And you formulate ideas as you go, don't you? And you mentioned that you're involved in data beforehand and looking at past data for brands so that they can plan, their future social conversations. Am I sort of jumping to conclusions when I think that StreamAlive was kind of born from that experience too, to bring it back to the real world?
Almost. There's one little bridge we're missing, which we actually touched upon very interestingly. So that's the nice thing about conversation.
Ooh.
Everything kind of connects. So the bridge is the book, is name, place, animal, thing, right? The reason I bring up the book again is the previous company, Unmetric, had gotten acquired towards the end of 2019. We had a personal emergency with our older son who had to be hospitalized in Berlin, literally airlifted here to the US. He was in hospital for a couple of months. He's good and well now, so everything ended up well afterwards. But this happened a week after the acquisition. So life got pretty crazy because the next 3 months after our company got acquired were us being in hospitals. And then we came back home, and then the whole world went into a lockdown because of the pandemic. So it was just a very, very surreal time. And once the transition happened, I took a break towards the middle of 2020, just realized I needed that, and also to focus on things at home. And that's when the book was born, because I had time on my hands and I had run out of excuses for not writing things that were otherwise in Post-it notes and on different Apple notes and things. And I strung that together into writing the book, right? This was towards the end of 2020, and I didn't know the first thing about writing a book. You might read the book and say, I still don't know the first thing about writing a book, but I didn't know the first thing about writing a book at that point. So I signed up for half a dozen courses on how to write a book, how to edit a book, how to market a book, how to get Amazon and the gods around Jeff Bezos to bless your book when you list it on Amazon and things like that, right?
I missed that course where I got the blessing for my book.
I'll give you my Venmo account and I can
another lockdown baby.
Oh, that's a lockdown baby as well. Okay. So you know exactly what I'm talking about then.
I do. It was that opportunity to kind of let muddy waters clear so that you
Absolutely.
could go, well, what do I want to do with this information? So, yeah. So once you got it blessed, what did you do?
So I'm going to borrow that expression, by the way, an opportunity to let muddy waters clear. That's a beautiful way of putting it. That's exactly what happened. Yeah. So I signed up for, I still remember the exact number. There were 56 live streams that I attended over the last quarter of 2020 for these 6 courses. And these were delivered on Zoom meetings, Zoom webinars, YouTube Live, Facebook Live, right? Class sizes were anywhere as less as 10 people to as much as 1,100 for the Amazon Blessings class.
Wow.
So that's where I noticed, there's something beautiful when you recurrently see something over such a tight compressed period, because then you start to see patterns. And I saw a couple of things. The first thing was that the chat flew by faster than the presenter could keep pace. There were conversations happening all the time, and they were not being counted because the presenter could not keep pace with what was happening in the chat. It was even crazier when the presenter would ask a question, like a standard opening question would be, "Hey, where are you joining from?" Right?
Yeah,
And then
you've got
people would go-
1,000 different locations popping
Exactly,
up in the chat.
right?
Yeah.
But the irony was, if you got 1,000 different locations, the presenter would call out 3 of those people, say, "We've got London in the house, we've got Mumbai in the house, we've got Lux from Jersey in the house," and then ignore the remaining 997 people, which is kind of unnatural, right? It would be pretty rude of me to ask you a question and then totally be oblivious to what you're giving as an answer. But we do it on a live stream because if the presenter were to read 1,000 locations, he should be a geography teacher.
Yes.
So that happened time and again, Wendy, where
I have noticed that and wondered how you could fix it.
The fixing it is what we do at StreamAlive. That's why I said the company was born from conversations, from seeing ignored conversations. And we said, that's why you saw connective tissue with what we did in the previous company, which is where we used to take unstructured data, as you observed, and give structured insights from that. In a similar vein, can you take unstructured data, aka real-time chat or chatter that is happening around a live stream on Zoom or on YouTube, and give it a structured and visual look, right? I mean, we say a picture is worth 1,000 words, but here 1,000 words could be worth a picture. For example, as people are typing locations, show a real-time map that maps them out with lights coming up as they type locations. So that's what we do.
Oh, it's like Santa's, good and bad list, isn't it?
That's a good idea for a feature. We should probably do something around that. Santa's list.
Yeah.
I mean, the whole thing is about making conversations more inclusive. So our pitch is we change these live streams from a current scenario where 95% of the people are ignored to one where 95% of the people will be included. Where if someone has a thing and an answer to how are you feeling today, that answer is not going to be lost among 998 other people chatting the same thing, but it's going to populate a real-time word cloud that if a majority of people are feeling happy or grateful, is going to show that by having that word bigger.
Yeah.
So context-aware conversation is kind of what we're trying to create over here, because when you ask people where you're joining from, they're not going to say happy or grateful. They're going to be saying a location. And when you ask them how you're feeling today, they're not going to be saying, Glasgow or London or New York. They're going to be saying a feeling. So there's context to this, which you can actually harness to give a collective voice to the audience by means of a visual. So interestingly, that's our fundamental premise. We make conversations count in terms of counting each and every person who's participating in a live stream or a chat. So again, I mean, this was born from the journey that came from the book, from attending live streams, and now it's a full-fledged company with many users who are across the gamut, who are teachers, who are preachers, who are sellers, who are entertainers, and people doing town halls, meetings, trainings. It's just a different way of conversing, where suddenly it's two-way and it's not just one way, right?
Where have you been, Lux? Honestly, because my own workshops, I put a stop to them because I didn't want it to be all about me through the screen. Every workshop that I've ever done has been about audience participation. So they're involved. They need to interact, and it was just too cumbersome to be able to deliver that when you've got multiple people coming through on a screen and a chat, and how can you converse? Because we haven't really learned, I don't think, how to be able to do that volume of multitasking without a little bit of help. And it sounds like you fixed the little bit of help problem.
That's certainly right down our alley, and it's interesting you mentioned the energy and the interactivity that you have in a live workshop, right? I'm sure you're no stranger to these situations where you ask the audience a question and you say, but let's have a show of hands. Okay, that's a great example. You have a show of hands. You're not having an individual conversation with each and every audience member, but you're taking a collective sense of the room saying, oh, okay, roughly 3/4 of you agree with this or have felt this pain that I just described.
Yeah.
So you've got you kind of eyeballed the results, so to speak, and that's all that is really needed at times. Everyone knows you can't have an individual conversation with people. So how can we replicate that collective sense of the audience in multiple ways in an online scenario is kind of what we're doing. And it's funny, as the world gets back to hopefully, fingers crossed, how it was a couple of years back. We built this for online meetings, but now we have people saying, hey, I've got this big conference happening with 3,500 people in December. And I love what you guys do at StreamAlive for online events. Can you do it for an offline one? And we're building that out so that paves the way to make it hybrid. So you have half a dozen people on Zoom and you have a few dozen people in a room, and they both can seamlessly be part of the same conversation and participate as a collective whole. And I think that's a phase of things to come where people are included, heard, irrespective of where they are physically or digitally.
That to me just sums up 100% inclusivity, because there will be still people that are going to shield or not want to attend for whatever reason. Geographically, it means that they're not excluded. It opens up the audience much, much wider. And of course, I love an in-person event and the energy in the room. And of course, you can't always look at 6 screens to see all of the different participants to try and gauge that body language. But when you're in a room, you feel that energy. You don't have to be touching anybody. And I think that's what we can't transcend over the internet yet, is it? Is that physicality.
Absolutely. And hopefully we'll never be able to transcend that, because there's something to be said about that physicality, that energy, right? So our thinking is you'll never get there, but how close can you get to that? How much of that can you replicate? How much more alive can you make the stream, and hence the name? I'm glad you said what you just said, because a lot of the inspiration has been from the to and fro banter that a performer like Freddie Mercury has with the audience when, they sing with each other. The Mexican wave.
Don't, because I'll just start bursting into song.
Please do. That's going to be fun.
Yeah, right? It is. It's because you as a presenter, you can feed off. It's like you're saying, earlier, how are we all feeling today? If there were 4 options there, and you could, give me a graphical metric of, are they good, bad, indifferent, no, didn't answer. Well, goodness, that gives you as an indication as a presenter as to how much of a hill you've got to climb today, or if they're present and open and willing, because sometimes you do really need to sort of pick people up. And, being online, there is nothing worse than having people on mute and on no video. So you've got these little black boxes everywhere and you have no idea how it's being received. How is that helping anybody?
But that's the interesting thing, right? Although, and I would love it for every single person to keep their video on and have that feedback loop, therefore. And I've spoken to comedians for whom that's very, very depressing when they're doing a stand-up set and they can't even see how people are reacting. And a lot of them had to do that through the pandemic. But here's the thing. People have different degrees of comfort levels in terms of putting their video. And they might have a genuine reason because maybe their room's in a mess or they're not comfortable showing, or they don't look good on camera. They got bad lighting, whatever, right? But they do tend to be very, very prolific with their opinions in the chat. So you mentioned polls, for example. That's a great example. If you don't mind my just diving into, that's one of our pet peeves with polls. I mean, all those things I attended, they would have polls. All those classes I attended, those 56 live streams, about maybe 15 of them had polls. But here's what they do. They would say, folks, we want your opinion. We want to know. We want you to be heard. We want to know what you're saying. So here's a QR code. Please scan this QR code, go to this website, enter this code number, and go out there and participate. And then we will show you in 3 minutes, what you said collectively by showing the poll. So not everyone, for every one person who would go out there, 2 or 3 people would put their opinion in the chat, and that would be thoroughly ignored because they didn't follow the instructions, right? And then so many people would put in the chat and the instructions would get buried and people would say, where are the instructions? I can't see them on screen anymore. So all of those were inspiring for us because it was very obvious there was something to be solved over here. And then people would enter in the poll, and then there would be absolute silence. And about a couple of minutes later, the presenter would say, okay, you have spoken. Here is what 10% of you said, because the remaining 90% either didn't figure out what to do or they put it in the chat, right? So that's a little thing of where you can actually harness the energy of the audience in a real-time way. So what we do, for example, is we put up the poll on the screen, in the StreamAlive screen, and the presenter says, okay, here are the 4 options, 1, 2, 3, 4. I want you to type in the chat 1 or 2 or 3 or 4. So I can see what you're typing, Wendy, and you can see what I'm typing. And it's not a state secret. So why not everybody see what everybody is typing? And we just type it in the Zoom chat or the YouTube chat or the chat that we are in. So we don't go out of the room. I mean, to us, that was like me meeting you at a conference, asking you a question. And just as you're about to answer, I say, no, hang on, Wendy. That's a poll answer. You need to go to the ballot box that is next to the cafeteria and put your answer there and come back and continue this conversation with me. You're not going to come back, right?
Yeah.
So when people put their answers in the chat, the polls dance. They literally race against each other. And the presenter is almost like a commentator at a horse race or something. Where saying, oh, okay, we actually had these entertainers who ask people, what do you want to hear? Do you want to hear jazz or hip hop or rock or pop? And okay, jazz is winning. Oh, no, it's rock. Oh, okay, pop is inching in. And they're almost like people, at a horse race. And everyone's looking at the poll. And the audience so that energy of the audience is literally being synthesized into these polls that are dancing and racing against each other. So though those people still had their videos off and we couldn't see them, they were channeling their energy through participating in the chat. And that had a real-time connotation. And therefore, that feedback loop was complete, right? So that kind of ties to the point earlier. You can never replicate the full real-world experience, but you can come to a better in-between point than what we've been in so far.
No, and you've just reminded me of a previous guest, Cathy O'Dowd. She's a lady who is the first lady to have climbed Everest to the summit from both sides.
Oh, wow. I should listen to this one. I missed this one. Okay.
And she actually did a presentation at a BNI Global event, which was why I reached out to her to ask her to come on the show. And it was in part because she was presenting through a piece of software that had multiple choice that you could, choose, but you were on your phone, and it was interesting to take part that way. But it was also a little bit distracting because you were doing something, like you say, outside of the room.
Right.
So by keeping it in the room is really, that's a smart move. It was asking questions of, at this particular juncture, what would you decide to do? And it's you're climbing Everest, it's life or death. And I think most of the audience died very early on at base camp. But it's that similarity of application that I could see, was working, that just needed polish. And it sounds to me like you've polished it.
That's certainly the hope. And what you just described, the way we talk about that is the current approach is one where people are asked to go to a product to participate. The polish that you've talked about is one where instead of asking people to go to a product, we've got the product to come to the people.
Yeah.
so they don't have to do anything different to participate. It's all about friction, right? If getting heard requires going through a lot of loops and stuff, you're not going to take the effort, because
Path
if you're
of
not willing to.
least resistance.
Exactly, the path of least resistance. I mean,
Yeah.
now we're talking about climbing Everest, but yeah, the path of least resistance.
I know, yeah. I'm certainly not on my bucket list.
Me neither. A lot of things I want to do, but climbing Everest is not one of them.
No, strangely. I'm fascinated that you've taken an experience and turned it into a company. I think it's absolutely admirable.
And then, like I said, that's why I was excited about being a guest on your podcast, because the company was born from conversations, from seeing conversations gone wrong in a one-to-many setting across those 56 live streams. And the company aims to solve conversations to make them a lot more inclusive by giving everybody a voice, right?
I'm just thinking of the amount of people that have actually been turned off by attending webinars and, free sessions or trials or learning, whatever it is, because it's quite boring to be sat and listening to and just being spoken to rather than being involved. So I can only imagine that this is going to just pique people's curiosity again to want to get involved, even if it is from the comfort of their own home.
That's exactly the hope. And then that's really why a lot of people have their cameras off as well, because they don't want you to see how Zoom fatigued they are.
Yeah.
Yeah, and if you can change that, maybe that'll change as well.
Gosh, it'd be boring, wouldn't it? You'd just stop doing it. You really just should stop doing it if all you've got is blank screens. We're going to carry on that conversation in just a moment. But first, the Wendy Woo tip is all about icebreakers. And there are lots of icebreakers that we use without even giving it a second thought. And the most popular ones are the weather and how did you get here? Did you find it okay? It's those sorts of open-ended, friendly gestured questions that can break the ice and get the conversation flowing. So if you want any more tips, head over to the Amazon store and pick up a copy of my book. Let's get back to the conversation with Lux, shall we? Oh dear, Lux, I love talking to you, but we've come to the point in the show where I never know what's coming next. So I did do a little bit of name, place, animal thing on you before you came on, so I knew roughly what we were going to be talking about. But this is where I ask you to share that one conversation that, had it not have happened, your life or career would not have changed.
So I guess I can't rewind back to the many conversations that happened from which StreamAlive was born, but we've talked about that. So let me actually totally shift tracks and talk about one conversation that was pretty important in my life. And this was at the previous company at Unmetric. Companies need to have an independent board member, and I got introduced to this gentleman called Ram Gupta, who's since been a dear friend, a very well-known person in Silicon Valley and everything. And he was the chairman of our board at Unmetric. And the first time we met, I expected him to go into what is your data structures and, how do you guys harness the data? What kind of insights do you do? And instead, he asked me, what sport do you play? And I said, you mean used to play? Because I used to play a lot of, football or soccer, as they call it here in the States. But I used to play a lot of football and I don't anymore. And then he spent 15 minutes asking me why, if I love football so much, why have I stopped playing? And then I kind of took refuge into, no, I got into squash. Okay, do you play squash? No, I don't. Okay, why not? And then we got into health. And then he told me one thing which stuck in my head for two reasons. One is for perspective, and the second is the power of analogies. So he said, look, Lakshman, you at any point in life, you're juggling these three balls, right? And one is the ball of health, and the second is the ball of relationships. And the third one is finances. And spoiler alert, your startup and everything that you think is you're so committed to is all around that third ball on finances, right? Now, the trick in life is balancing all three and juggling them and keeping them up in the air at the same time, which all of us go through. But I'd like you to remember one thing: the one that's around finances is made of steel. So if you drop it, it might dent a bit, but sure, you can pick it up again and use it, right? The one that's around relationships is made of porcelain, and if it falls, it's going to crack. You can take a bit of super glue and stick it back together, but the fissures will show. So the relationships that you've not had time to nurture because you're so busy in juggling that ball of steel are going to develop into cracks. So don't ever ignore your relationships. And here's the bad news: the one that's on health, which is dependent on you playing a sport and focusing on your health and taking care of things, is made of glass. And if that falls, it's going to shatter into 100 pieces, and there's no way you can put that together. So please remember this as we go forward, because though I'm on your board and stuff, I want you to remember that your health comes first, your relationships come next, and company work and all those things come third, right? So as you get embroiled in things, this is something I use as a mental model because it's very, very powerful. And interestingly, Ram became a dear friend and guide, and he is a fourth co-founder on the team at StreamAlive now as well, because when we started the company, I said, I can't think of anyone better to be on our board than you. So why don't you join from day one and instead of joining us later? And he did. But this conversation is something I constantly remember, and which is why I've gotten into playing pickleball, which is also much the rage over here in the States now and things.
What on earth is pickleball?
Oh, no, don't ask. Unless you got another half an hour or something. Let me put it this way. If badminton, table tennis, and tennis had a baby, that baby would be pickleball.
Okay. Just a challenge then for the listeners. You're going to have to just Google it, I'm afraid. But it's interesting, isn't it? It's fascinating how that one conversation and how that was explained to you. Obviously, scenarios, situations, experiences arise, and you're evaluating based on that analogy of those three things for you to say, where will this lead me to if I do this? How will it affect the other two? And, mixing it up and juggling them as you do to be sure that you keep that balance.
I think it's a beautiful analogy. And at least for me, it struck a chord. And yes, exactly what you said. Once in a while, it helps you take stock.
Yes. No, absolutely. And I wonder just how many of our listeners needed to hear about you and Ram's conversation today.
I hope they focus on the glass ball.
Yes, it certainly made me go, goodness, I've been doing a bit more of that myself recently. And other things just naturally look after themselves.
They do, right? Yeah.
Well, look, you're such an easygoing guy to talk to. I haven't asked you the one last question, which is, what's your best joke? If you want to give us your best joke, you can. But otherwise, I always encourage listeners to carry on the conversation with guests and come and find you if they want to find out more about StreamAlive or, any of the other topics that we touched on, like comedy, obituaries, and your book. Where's the best place for them to come and find you?
Okay, so the best joke part is I have a 5-minute stand-up comedy set, which is on my website. So my personal website is Lux Narayan. That's LuxNarayan, luxnarayan.com. And StreamAlive and everything StreamAlive, including free access to the application and a free trial and everything. It's totally free at this point, in fact, is at streamalive.com. So please, stay in touch with me, stay in touch with StreamAlive. Would love to continue the conversation.
That'd be fantastic. Lux, you're an absolute diamond, and they're hard to break. Thanks so much for
Love that analogy. Thank you. That's very kind of you. Thank you.
So who'd have thought that reading obituaries would lead to an idea for a book and an idea for a platform to bring people closer together and to feel more connected? I think it's absolutely fabulous. So if you really want to find out more about what Lux is doing in the live chat space, and you need to stay better connected with people attending your webinars or showing up online, do reach out and carry on the conversation, and make sure to tell him where you heard of him. Well, next time we have the very one and only John Barrows on the show, and I could listen to his dulcet tones about making calls and sales and all other sales tips.
Man, I will give you as many techniques, tactics, and tips as you can possibly imagine so that you can figure out how to get to the point where you're unconsciously competent with a lot of the stuff that you do. And that's where it turns into the real conversation.
Don't forget to tune in. Hit that follow and subscribe button on your favourite podcast so you never miss an upcoming episode.